am Kari Borne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services, and I've been doing so since 1983, so we're happy to be back again this year. I'll introduce today's speaker. He is Eric Loepp, and he's an associate professor of political science and the director of learning technology at UW-Whitewater, where he teaches courses in American government, political behavior, and research methods. His research focuses on candidate evaluations and electoral decision-making, particularly in primary elections. This work has been published in such journals as the Journal of Political Science Education, PS, Political Science and Politics, Electoral Studies, the Journal of Elections, Public Opinion and Parties, Research and Politics, Social Sciences Quarterly, Election Law Journal, and American Politics Research. Please welcome Dr. Eric Loepp.
Thank you, friends. Can I just get one more confirmation that you can hear me okay? We're good most of the way around? Okay, wonderful.
Have you got a microphone?
I do, right? I can barely feel it and you can barely see it. It's pretty fancy these days. Well, happiest of Mondays to you all. When Kari and I got together earlier this year to talk about the events that we would do together this fall, we thought, we should probably do mine towards the end when we have a better sense of who's going to win the election, right? At this point, I don't know that we're any better off than we were in September, but it's my pleasure to be with you anyway. Walking from campus today with the fall leaves is just so pleasant this time of year. And we're going to talk about what we know and what we don't know, and at the end, what we think about the big election happening. Let's see, what are we? 8 days from now. Holy cow, 8 days away from now. So to keep myself on track, I always like to have something of a blueprint for our afternoon. The first thing we'll do is we'll talk about 6 different outcomes that might happen next week as far as the Electoral College goes. Then we'll talk more specifically about what we might expect to happen here in Wisconsin. And then the third section, which I did not talk about last time I did one of these talks because it's new, we're going to talk about what the new maps in Wisconsin might mean for what happens at the state level in Wisconsin. That is a pretty important development too, not to be too overshadowed by the presidential race next Tuesday. So if you're ready to jump in, let's do it. And if anybody was here when I did this talk in 2020, you might remember that I led off with the exact same slide that I'm leading off with today. We're looking here at a note written by President George Herbert Walker Bush as he left office in January of 1993. He left a note for his successor, Bill Clinton. And here's what he said. Dear Bill, when I walked into this office just now, I felt the same sense of wonder and respect that I felt 4 years ago. I know you will feel that too. I wish you great happiness here. I never felt the loneliness some presidents have described. There will be very tough times, made even more difficult by criticism you may not think is fair. I'm not a very good one to give advice, but just don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. You will be our president when you read this note. I wish you well. I wish your family well. Excuse me. Your success is now our country's success. I'm rooting hard for you. Good luck, George. And every time we get into something that's 50-50, or can you believe what they just said, I always like to start off with hopefully cooler minds and thoughtfulness will prevail. But there's no doubt that it's a very contentious election and we live in a very polarized time. So I don't know that we'll see a note just like this anytime soon, but I'm hoping that no matter how things break next week, everyone in here will find and will give the grace to their neighbors who are maybe less happy with the outcome, as I'm sure George Herbert Walker Bush was. So with that, let's walk through Election Day scenarios. Now, it's funny. Everyone's saying right now, we don't know who's going to win the election. We don't know what's going to happen, and that's true. But we know about 86% of the election, actually. We could tell right now how 43, maybe 42 states are going to vote. I know it's a little bit hard to contrast here, but we know already Kamala Harris is virtually guaranteed 225 electoral college votes. She needs 270 to win. Donald Trump is pretty much guaranteed 219. He also needs to get to 270. And the only states that we're not pretty darn sure about at this point, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. All the others, we're pretty sure how things are going to go next week. It doesn't mean there couldn't be a surprise, but I'm from Oregon. My mom visited me recently, and I said, Mom, are there any lawn signs or television commercials about the election out west? And she said, not a single one. How nice might that be, right? And the reason she's not seeing that is because Oregon's elections at the federal level, at least, are not going to be especially close. Although I recently read that there's a mayor's race in Portland, Oregon now with something like 15 candidates. I'm trying to imagine trying to make sense of all that. Good luck, Portland. So we're about 86% of the way there. And the states that we're not sure of this year were the same ones we weren't really sure of in 2020. The reason Joe Biden won the election is because that all but one of those swing states in 2020, the same ones I just mentioned, they all broke for Joe Biden. Nevada did, Arizona did, Georgia did, Michigan did, Wisconsin did, Pennsylvania did. The only swing state in 2020 that Donald Trump won was North Carolina. Right? And that was good enough for 306 electoral college votes for Joe Biden. The same number that Donald Trump got in 2016, by the way. How's that for interesting? So we have to decide, or we get to decide in a week, but we can guess a little bit right now what might happen with those 7 gray states. And so what I'll share with you is kind of my assessment, borrowing a little bit from the experts that do this more than I do, for what we might expect to happen on Election Day. And what I'll do is give you 6 different scenarios. First, we'll talk about what is the easiest way for Donald Trump to win and for Kamala Harris to win. Then we'll talk about a somewhat less likely but still plausible or possible path for each of them to win. And then we'll talk about kind of the perfect world. And I say perfect plausible world because if you ask them, the perfect world is they win all 50 states, right? That's not going to happen. But there's a perfect plausible world, the kind of the best thing that is even in the world of possibility, right? Although I suppose I should note that a presidential candidate has won 49 out of 50 states before. Does anybody remember when that happened? Goldwater, I don't think he got quite there, but Nixon got there in 72, somewhat after Goldwater. It happened more recently than that, though, believe it or not. I'll give you a hint. My students in the room were not born. The year was 1984. Ronald Reagan won 49 out of 50 states. I'm trying to imagine an election night that boring. I mean, what would the media do all evening? They're just sitting at their desk with nothing to talk about. I don't think that's going to happen. But let's talk about what might happen, right? And we'll go through each of these one by one. So the easiest pathway for Donald Trump to win is what I'm calling the Sunbelt +1 pathway. And what that means is that Donald Trump wins in the warmer, sunnier parts of the country, wins Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. He can afford to give up Nevada, but you got to win in the really, really warm parts of the country in the South. And then he would just need to win one of the Midwestern states, including the one we're standing in right now. Right? Why is this a good case for him, or the most likely path? Well, for one, Donald Trump has enjoyed a somewhat more consistent lead in the polling in those southern states, although, as my students will tell you, polling doesn't really mean anything right now. But he does have a fairly consistent lead. He's made a lot of gains among non-white voters, especially younger and Latino and Hispanic voters, which tend to live more in the southern parts of the country. And don't forget, as close as things were in Wisconsin, it was also really close in Georgia and Arizona last time, too. There's not a lot of votes that need to be made up, right? For Kamala Harris, what's her easiest pathway? Well, her easiest pathway is hold the blue wall, as we say. If she can keep Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania in her pocket, if she can win them the way that Joe Biden did, she can afford to yield all the warm, sunnier parts of the country to Donald Trump, from Nevada all the way across to North Carolina. This upper Midwest where we are is really, really pivotal. And although the election is really, really close in all 3 of these states, it's probably the most likely one where Harris can win, right? Interestingly, I was talking with my student Mike on a walk over here, and one thing I didn't mention, because I wanted to surprise him in the middle of the talk, is that Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania have all voted together since 1992. They've never split. Doesn't mean they can't next week, but they've always voted the same direction. They've always voted Democratic, except for 1 year, 2016. Right? So this is the easiest path for her because, again, her polls, to the extent we can trust them, are somewhat better in the north. There's also fewer voters in this region of the type that tend to join the Donald Trump coalition. Right? In the South, you have more voters who would be more inclined to support Donald Trump if they're voting for the first time, whereas Harris has more of a get out the vote, turnout game going in the upper Midwest, and that tends to be somewhat easier it's easier to convince people who already like you to show up than to convince people to like you in the first place. So those are the two most likely things we'll see next week. Right? But let's talk about a couple of maybe options. For Donald Trump, a maybe option would be something like knock down the blue wall, where he wins the Midwest where we are right now, but there's something of a split. Maybe he gives up North Carolina and Nevada, and in this situation, he would have to win the Rust Belt where we are, and then he would have to pick up either Georgia or Arizona. He would only need one of the two. Right? In this example here, he's at 263 electoral college votes, so he only needs either Georgia or Arizona. But if he can knock down the blue wall, he doesn't have to win everywhere else. He would just need to pick up Georgia or Arizona. Right? Now, North Carolina, remember, that is the only state that voted for Donald Trump in 2020 among the swing states. Right? So that one could go either way again. They have a very, very interesting race for their governor's office right now. If you followed that race at all, there's been some really, really interesting, shall we say, developments. So there's a lot of questions about what that means in terms of turnout and who's going to participate next week. But if Donald Trump can go back to what he did in 2016, win the Rust Belt, he really only needs to get one of the medium-sized states in the South to join him, and he will be north of the magic number of 270. For Harris, what is her possible, less likely but somewhat possible route? It would be kind of the inverse of what we've been talking about. It's possible that she has a great day in the warmer parts of the country, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. She can give up the upper Midwest if that happens. Now, candidates are never going to say, oh, I've given up on any region of the country. But I promise you, they're crunching numbers, right? And right now they're deciding, where do we send Kamala Harris? Where do we send Donald Trump for the last week of the campaign, right? Which direction do we point the airplane? And if there were a sense on the Harris team that, well, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania are lost, but we're really hanging in there in Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, she would stay south of the Mason-Dixon line until election night. Now, I don't know that that's happening. It's probably not happening. But it's a good example of something plausible, which is maybe Harris doesn't do so well in our neck of the woods, but actually picks things up in the South. Right? So, again, if Harris can hang on to North Carolina the way Biden did, she can give up the Rust Belt states, and she, like Trump a couple slides ago, would really only need to get one of those medium-sized, really close states in the South. Right? So now, just for fun, let's talk about the most amazing night you could expect if you're Donald Trump in the world of reality, right? Plausibility. And that is, you win the Southwest, you win the Southeast, and you win the Midwest, upper Midwest, excuse me, right? Something like that is certainly plausible. That would have Trump at a very comfortable 339 electoral college votes. And at that point, I was doing the math. How many states would Harris win that is not touching a great big body of water? There's only a couple, really. Colorado, New Mexico, right? I think all the rest would be either on an ocean, a Great Lake, or an international border, if I'm looking at that properly. So is this likely to happen? Probably not, but this is kind of the best case scenario that Donald Trump could hope for. Oregon is voting for Harris. I can tell you that right now. So is California. On the flip side, kind of the best Harris could hope for is finishing up somewhere around 318 electoral college votes, where the same thing breaks her way in the other direction. She wins the upper Midwest, she wins North Carolina and Georgia in the Southeast, and she wins Nevada, Arizona, out west. Again, probably not likely to happen. That would be quite a big night, and the data that we have does not suggest that it's going to be a blowout. But both of them have these kind of perfect scenarios that some of their staff are probably making bets, in back rooms and such about. But the most likely thing would be one of those first two, where they're going to win somewhere around 300 to 310 electoral college votes. Now, some of you may have heard of the website 538. This is a website that was created in 2012, and they kind of specialize in trying to forecast or predict elections using a bunch of fancy numbers. And they're kind of famous for giving Donald Trump the best shot of winning in 2016, although they still had Hillary Clinton winning. They gave her about a 75% chance of winning. But that was actually a lot less than a lot of people in my industry who gave her 95. Right, so 538 has become a go-to every day. A lot of people in my class, every day to start class, we look, where's 538 today? What's the projection? Well, as of a couple of hours ago, 538 gives Donald Trump about a 54 out of 100 chance of winning, and Harris about a 46. Now, a few days ago, I was down in Janesville. Kari and I were down in Janesville. We were doing a very similar talk to this one, and when we came to this slide then, it was 52 for Donald Trump and 48 for Harris. This was just a few days ago. So these numbers are changing and evolving, but they've been moving pretty consistently in small increments, but consistently towards Donald Trump. For most of our class this semester, correct me if I'm wrong, fellas in the room, but when we started off class, Harris had the higher number than Trump until just about a week and a half ago. The last few class periods, Donald Trump's been slightly above Harris. And I don't know if there are people here who enjoy gambling, but I don't know that I would make any bet on a 52 to 48 proposition or even a 54 to 46 proposition, right? So it's incredibly close. And the one thing I can tell you with certainty about everybody who's trying to predict what can happen, I can tell you for sure, nobody knows. If anyone is telling you, I can guarantee you it's going to be this and here's why, that's not true. Nobody knows. It is impossible to know how we should have predicted the election until after the election. It's one of the great ironies in election forecasting. We can do a pretty good job of, that's what we should have done. But we need to see what happens on election day to know what we should have done beforehand to predict it. So it is absolutely too close to call. Have fun chatting about it, and I'll encourage you not to buy too much of what somebody who's promising they know the outcome is selling, because I guarantee you nobody does. Okay, so with that, we have a couple of scenarios. We've seen what's likely, what's less likely. Let's talk now a little bit about our home state of Wisconsin, right? A pivotal state always, but now we have a lot to think about at both the federal and the state level. So the first thing I always like to do when I talk about Wisconsin is kind of clear up a myth that you sometimes see in the media. There's this myth that Wisconsin is part of this blue wall, and it came down in 2016, but now it's back up again, right? It's a solid blue region. And that's not true at all, right? If you look at the difference between the winner and the loser in Wisconsin in this century, it's always incredibly close unless Barack Obama's running, right? When he's on the ballot, for whatever reason, Wisconsin responded to that guy. But it was so funny, and this is, I think, a trap that some people fell into in 2016. People thought, well, Obama won by double digits the last 2 years. Wisconsin is blue, right? Did anybody go to a Hillary Clinton rally in Wisconsin in 2016? It's a trick question. She didn't have any, right? They thought Wisconsin was in the bag. But if you go back before Obama, it was really close when George Bush ran against Al Gore. It was really close when George Bush ran against John Kerry. So we're a swing state, right? We are a swing state. But if you look on this page here, we'll see the Democrats still won all those races except in 2016. What happened in 2016? And what should we be thinking about now? Right? Well, I'll show you a couple of graphics that tell us a whole lot about this. Right? We don't have to go county for county here, but one of the biggest things that happened in Wisconsin between 2012 and 2016 that led to Wisconsin flipping from blue to red is that there was a big jump, especially in northern Wisconsin, in the more Republican parts of the state. There was a big jump in participation. right? Basically, the darker the shade of red, the more Republicans voted in a given county, right? And you can see up north in Wisconsin, all these big counties that had massive, we're talking 20 to 33% increases in the number of Republicans who voted. If we look at Madison and Milwaukee, right, the more Democratic parts of the state, they had slight increases, right? But more like 10, 11% differences, right? So if you're wondering what happened, it's not like the whole state switched from red to blue. What happened is a lot of people in the redder parts of the state voted when they hadn't voted before. And the pollsters who were talking about Hillary Clinton winning in 2016, what they got wrong, and they could not have known this until after the election, what they missed, what they failed to do, was account for the fact that there are a bunch of people, particularly younger men who didn't go to college. There's a bunch of those folks in upper, look at me, look, I'm in Michigan, northern Wisconsin, excuse me, right? There's a lot of new voters up there that hadn't voted before, and that's why 2016 was such a surprise, right? We'll look at one other graph, I promise. We won't make it too technical, but it's great to visualize this stuff. If we look at the counties in Wisconsin that are especially high in terms of how many white Americans live there and how many working class Americans live there, we can again see the increase, right, in how much people in those counties voted, right? So here, the darker the purple, the more there was an increase between 2012 and 2016. And you'll notice the big increases are not in Dane County, they're not in Milwaukee, they're up north. Right? And there was just enough, right? When I talk to my students about how do we conceptualize and visualize election results, one of the best ways I found to do that is to explain it in terms of Lambeau Field. The difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016 was about one end zone of Lambeau Field. The entire state of Wisconsin, it was about 20,000 votes. So one end zone, one Bucks playoff game, right? However you can visualize 20,000 people, that's it, in a state with millions of voters. Right? So 2020 comes along, right? And Democrats really want Wisconsin back. How did they do it? Well, here's a map showing how big the margin of victory was in 2020 between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So blue circles mean Joe Biden won, red circles mean Donald Trump won, and then the bigger the circle, the bigger the margin. Right? So Joe Biden could win 51-49 in one county, but he could win 70-30 in another county. Right? So the bigger the circle, the bigger the difference. And the reason Joe Biden was able to win back Wisconsin was because of serious increases in Madison and in Milwaukee. Again, it's not like all the Republicans in Wisconsin said, you know what, I think I was wrong about Donald Trump, and I'm going to switch to Joe Biden this time. It was much more the case that Joe Biden was better than Hillary Clinton at getting voters in Milwaukee and in Madison to show up on Election Day. Remember 2016? Remember that Bernie Sanders person? A lot of people on the political left were not happy about what happened in the nomination. Madison loved Bernie, right? Turnout in Madison in 2016 was pretty down, right? That helped Donald Trump. But those voters came back in 2020. Right? My favorite map of all is this one. This shows you arrows that indicate, did the county vote more Democratic than Republican in 2020 or more Republican than Democratic? So if the county has a red arrow to the right, that county got more Republican. If it has a blue arrow to the left, that county got more Democratic. And then the size of the arrow tells you how much the difference was between 2016 and 2020. So again, counties that voted for Biden still voted for Biden. Counties that voted for Trump still voted for Trump. The difference is that Joe Biden was able to get people in Madison and Milwaukee and Green Bay to show up. A lot of Republican counties had increases too, but guess what? Those counties have much smaller populations, right? And again, in 2020, what did we have between Trump and Biden? About one end zone of Lambeau Field. That was the difference. Right. One more map of Wisconsin, I promise. This is a map, 2016 on the left, 2020 on the right. It's showing you which counties went for the Republican and which counties went for the Democrat. And then the number in there, I don't know if you can see them, we don't need to worry about the number, but it's telling you the difference, how much more the Democrat or Republican won by in that county. So the first thing I'll ask, if you can see, I know it's a little bit small, How many counties voted for Trump in 2016, but then flipped and voted for Biden in 2020? Do you see any counties that changed from red to blue? Door County is one. Door County was Donald Trump won it by 3.2, and then Joe Biden won it by 1.4. Door County flipped. There's one more. Anyone see it? Salt County, just northwest of Madison, exactly. Barely went to Donald Trump and then barely went to Joe Biden. We have 99 counties in this state. 97 of them voted exactly the same way they did last time. All right? When people talk about Wisconsin changing red, blue, it's not because everybody changed their mind. It's a matter of who showed up that day. And the reason Biden was able to win was things like in Dane County, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won by 47%. That's a pretty healthy margin, right? But it wasn't enough in 2016. Joe Biden won it by about 53%. And that difference was enough. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip one thing here, but that's okay. Last thing I'll show you on Wisconsin, the projections this morning, best guess, as of today, as of 11:38 this morning, I think it was. In Wisconsin, Harris, 47.9%, Trump, 47.8%. So, if you are one who's inclined to wait until the Wisconsin election results are known, start eating your protein now, right? Stretch, hydrate, plan your sleeping schedule, because next Tuesday could be a fairly long night. Right. So, briefly, before we talk about the state level in Wisconsin, what is it going to take to win? Right? I've kind of hinted at it, but let's kind of summarize what it will take to win Wisconsin in 2024. All right. I've already indicated that persuasion is not really the way politics works these days. Right? If a candidate is going to knock on doors and they run into somebody who's completely opposite of them politically, they're probably not going to have a lot of luck spending all their time trying to convince those people to change their mind. What they might be able to do, though, is find some voters who maybe haven't thought about it yet, or maybe are ambivalent, or maybe actually already like the candidate, but maybe are not sure whether they can be bothered to vote. Right? Those are the types of folks candidates can work at to keep the enthusiasm up. I promise you, Kamala Harris will win Dane County, and she'll win in Milwaukee. That's not what matters. What matters is how much she wins by. Right? When Hillary Clinton won by 47% in Madison, not enough. When Joe Biden won it by 53%, it was enough. So when you're watching on election night, don't just look at which counties we know who's going to win the counties. Door County, Salt County, maybe we don't know. But pretty much everywhere else in Wisconsin, we know how the counties are going to vote. So we're going to want to look at how much do they win by? Where can Harris and Trump keep the voters excited to make sure they show up, right? You may be familiar with the WOW counties, right, outside of Milwaukee, right? Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington. Those are always pretty good indicators of where Wisconsin is going. So on election night, I encourage you, when you hear people talking about the WOW counties, that's when you want to pay attention, right? Those suburbs are going to give us a real good sense of where Wisconsin is going to go. So number one, keep the enthusiasm up. Focus on getting your voters to show up, not trying to convince people to join you, right? Number two, kind of related to that, both parties have key groups within the electorate that they really need to show up, right? Donald Trump in particular will benefit greatly if there are a lot of new voters who've not voted before and who do not have a college degree. That is increasingly a group in America that tends to vote Republican. For Kamala Harris, it's voters of color, especially in Milwaukee. Right? Now remember, Harris is going to win that group. But one of my goals for today is to share with you that it's not who wins and who loses. What matters is how much they win by. Hillary Clinton won Milwaukee too, but she did not win it by a large enough margin. So Harris really needs to keep the energy up, particularly among voters of color. And then key number three, something we talk about in my class a lot, is what we might call priming the conversation. And what I mean by that is we sometimes get lulled into this idea that elections are about two candidates debating an issue, and the voters are comparing Donald Trump's answer and Kamala Harris's answer on an issue. Now, that might happen sometimes, but what really matters is not what are the two competing answers to the same question. What really matters is what question are people talking about? Both candidates want the last few days of the election to be focused on different issues. I promise you that if Donald Trump could wave a magic wand and ensure that only two issues are talked about over the next week, he would say, I want the economy to be talked about, and I want immigration to be talked about. If that is what voters are thinking about on Election Day, it benefits Republicans mightily. Harris would change that slightly. She'd like to talk about the economy, because that's what voters are saying they care about a lot right now. But she would also like the conversation to be on reproductive rights. So let's just imagine that the economy cancels each other out, right? If each candidate can only pick one issue that's not the economy for voters to be talking about over the next 8 days, Donald Trump would say immigration, immigration, immigration. Kamala Harris would say reproductive rights, reproductive rights, reproductive rights. Right? So again, it does matter what the competing answers are on certain questions, but what arguably matters more in this home stretch is what issues are people even talking about? Right? So on Election Day, if you're talking to colleagues or family, ask them, like, what's on your mind today? What are you thinking about? Are you thinking about education? Are you thinking about healthcare? Are you thinking about world peace, the economy, immigration? Right? And if you hear a lot of people saying, well, I'm thinking about immigration, right? That's a good sign for Donald Trump. If you talk to a lot of people who say, well, I'm really, really concerned, and everyone in my circle is talking about reproductive rights, if you hear that, it's a good day for Kamala Harris. The last thing that I'll talk about for a little bit before I eagerly open it up to a larger group conversation is what's happening in Wisconsin at the Wisconsin level. You know, we just talked about reproductive rights, and there's a lot of implications for that, the Supreme Court and everything else. It matters at the federal level, I promise you. But the Dobbs decision a couple years ago that overturned Roe v. Wade, what did that do? It sent the issue to the states, and every state can do what that state wants to. So what happens at the state level, my point is, really matters. Right? So let's talk about why things are different in Wisconsin now. This is something I did not talk about in 2020. Right? So I'm going to show you a pretty famous map. I know there's a lot of small numbers on it. Don't worry about all the details, but here's the summary. Up until 2010, the way it worked was the party in Wisconsin that got the most votes tended to get the most seats in the Wisconsin Assembly. So if you are able to zoom in 2008, Democrats got just over 50% of the votes, and that turned into just over 50% of the seats. In 2010, Republicans got a little more than half the votes and a little more than half the seats. But then something changed. After 2010, we had that national census. We just did another one a couple years ago, you might remember. And every time we do a census in this country, 2000, 2010, 2020, every time we do a census, we have to redraw the maps that set up our assembly in Congress, at the state level, all over the place. Because if a certain state grows in population, you might need to give it new seats in Congress. If another state loses population, you might have to take some away. So every 10 years, we have to redraw these maps to make sure that roughly the same number of people are in every single district in a legislature. Right? That's one of the few things the Constitution says about how we do our elections and our legislatures. Every district needs to have about the same number of people. What happened in 2010, though, was this was the Tea Party era, you might remember. Scott Walker was elected governor, and the maps were redrawn in 2010 to give a major benefit to the Republican Party in Wisconsin. If we look at the vote shares and the seat shares in 2012, the first election after we got these new maps, Democrats got a little more than half the votes, but Republicans got quite a bit more than half the seats. Right? Now, if everyone wants to talk about gerrymandering, I have a whole talk on that. We could do that some other time. But the short version is, in 2010, maps were redrawn in Wisconsin. These new maps heavily favored Republicans, and by that I mean Republicans got far more seats in the legislature than they did the percentage of the vote on election day. Right? For Republicans in the room, that's a good deal. For Democrats in the room, not such a good deal, right? And all throughout the 2010s, there were court cases and legal battles and public opinion media. Wisconsin was constantly being talked about as the most gerrymandered and rigged state in America, right? And mathematically, that was arguably true. Now, to be clear, many other states have done it. And by the way, Democrats have done it too, right? Gerrymandering is a temptation of anybody in power wanting to keep their power, but we tend to associate it with Republicans because Republicans have had more success with it lately. But then something happened recently. Just in the last year or so. We had another census in 2020, right? We had to redraw the maps, and a very interesting thing happened in Wisconsin. The Republican legislature agreed to the maps proposed by, anybody know? Governor Evers, a Democrat. So we've seen the last year or so all sorts of news stories about, holy cow, what might this mean for Wisconsin? Because the new maps, I've seen them, I'm not an expert on them, but I've looked at them enough to know they are going to be much less gerrymandered than the ones we had up until this year. Right? Maps are redrawn. I mean, the 43rd district where we are right now, it used to be that the university was split between two different assembly districts. Now we are in one. Right? Now you put an entire university in rural Wisconsin in a single assembly district, that's going to change. It's going to change the electorate a bit, don't you think? Right? The candidate running for that district on the Democratic side, by the way, she lives 2 blocks away. She came to my class the other day, and they're feeling pretty confident. Right? So why on earth would Republicans join the map proposed by their nemesis in the Capitol, Governor Evers? Well, the short version is this. The reason they agreed to Tony Evers' maps is because they were worried that if they didn't, and a different set of maps worked its way through the court system all the way up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, they would actually get worse maps than the ones Evers was offering. That's why they signed on to it. It was a calculated risk, like, why don't we take this? This is going to be painful, but if we don't do something now, the Supreme Court might make it more painful 6 months from now. That was their calculus. There's actually a senator who put it in a somewhat colorful way. I'll apologize for some of the language, but it's what they said. Republicans were not stuck between a rock and a hard place. It was a matter of choosing to be stabbed, shot, poisoned, or led to the guillotine. Maps. We chose to be stabbed so we can live to fight another day. Right? So take that as you will. The point for us, though, is that all of a sudden, I came here in 2015. That's when I started at the university. Ever since then, since I've been here, right, we've had a fairly gerrymandered map and a not particularly balanced legislature relative to the popular vote. Now, this year, there's talk of Democrats taking control of the assembly, of winning a majority of the lower house of the Wisconsin legislature. This conversation would never have happened until the last year or so. And if they do, you could imagine the implications that might have for state governing. Now, I'll as a little teaser / bursting of a balloon for those who are excited about this, Republicans are going to keep the Senate. Right? So it's not like there's going to be unified Democratic control in Wisconsin starting in January. But it is plausible, right? It is plausible that we have a Democratic governor here and a Democratic assembly and a state Senate that is still Republican overall but more balanced, right? Those are some pretty serious implications, right, for things like legislation related to reproductive rights or funding for the university system. Right? When I gave this talk in Janesville, we were talking about how long the roads were closed to fix some of those interchanges in Janesville. Right? All those kinds of things will depend on what happens at the state level too. Right? So the short version is this. This is just to talk about how close Wisconsin is. Right? There's a pollster at Marquette Law School, John Johnson, who summarized it very well. For Democrats to win, they need to run as well as Tony Evers did in 2022. For Republicans to win, they need to run as well as Ron Johnson did in 2022. Don't forget, in 2022, Republican senator, Democratic governor, same year. Right? So both parties are trying to replicate that. And it gets even hairier than that, I think, just gnarly, right? Nail biters. There are 8 assembly seats that are really competitive, right? A lot of them we can be, just like the states, we can be pretty sure we know how they're going to go. But get this, of the 8 really competitive seats in the assembly, 4 of them, districts 85, 88, 92, and 94, for those interested, they are located in districts, mostly up north, that were won in 2022 by Johnson and by Evers. There are 4 districts that Governor Johnson, Republican, won in 2022, and Tony Evers, Democrat, also won in 2022. These are the ones to look out for. The chairman of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, he's feeling pretty good, although I was thinking about it the other day. If he wasn't feeling good, he wouldn't say so. So, he's always going to be optimistic. But he's putting out there, he's saying, look, I think this is our time in Wisconsin to win back the assembly. There's issues, school funding, Medicaid expansion, et cetera, that voters really care about. And don't forget, in Wisconsin, 20,000 people may be the difference. So to start wrapping up, let's tie both ends of our conversation together, right? We often think of state and federal elections as different, and they are. There's some big differences, but they're very related to each other, right? I mean, how many times has a presidential candidate, a senator, or a former president visited Wisconsin in the last week? I mean, help me out, students. Barack Obama was here recently. Liz Cheney was here recently. Kamala Harris was here recently. Donald Trump was here recently. J.D. Vance was just in Racine the other day. Right? So whichever presidential candidate can keep their team fired up on Election Day will benefit their party in the state as well. Same thing in the other direction. If the state Democratic Party can keep the energy up for Tammy Baldwin, for Eric Hovde, that's going to benefit the presidential election as well. Right? So we'll see. One more time, I know I said it before, so I won't dwell on it. Are Democrats going to flip the Senate? Not this year. They are hoping they might be able to in 2026 if all goes well. The goal this year is to just kind of take a little bit back, seat by seat, right? So we're not going to have a unified Democratic legislature next year, right? But it could end up being a lot more Democrats in elected office than we've seen in Wisconsin in quite some time, and that would have some major implications for us at the state level. So with that, my favorite part of doing any event like this is to talk to you all. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? Because I'm looking at computer screens all day, talking to students. We're really deep into it. What are you thinking about what's going on in the world? What else would we like to talk about, expand on, explore?